The house on Westover Lane knew how to hold a Sunday morning. It pressed quiet into the corners the way old churches hold incense, soft and steady, a hush that felt like a prayer. Light sifted through tall panes of glass and laid gentle squares across polished floors. In the sunroom, a little girl with messy blonde hair sat cross-legged on a braided rug, her tongue caught between her teeth. Her world narrowed to a piece of thick white paper and a circle of colored pencils. "Miss Ruby is going to love this," she whispered, and the whisper was not just sound, but hope made small. On the paper, two figures stood shoulder to shoulder under a bright, uneven sun. One wore a blue dress and had pale hair that fell like a waterfall. The other wore a headscarf the color of blueberries and had warm brown skin and soft, laughing eyes. Around them, hearts bobbed like balloons. At the top, in letters that bumped into each other the way children's letters do, it said, "My real family." Leah Walker, 7 years old, dream builder, truth teller, small enough to hide behind a curtain, but large enough to carry the love of two people at once, blue on the paper as if drying paint. She stood, shaking one leg to get it awake again, and dashed for the stairs. Upstairs, in a room where sunlight turned laundry into folded ships with crisp white sails, a woman turned at the sound of rushing feet. "Let me see this treasure, then," she said, with a smile that warmed the air. She took the paper with the caution of a jeweler receiving a diamond. "Oh, little flower, you made our smiles just right." There was a rhythm to Ruby James that soothed a house the way rain soothes a field. At 33, she had learned the art of moving invisibly in places built to be seen. She knew which stairs groaned and which doors sighed and which drawers would stick, and when to put an extra spoon of sugar in the cocoa because a bad dream demanded a little sweetness. She knew the songs that chased fevers, the hum that stopped hiccups, the exact cadence of prayer that calmed nightmares without frightening a child into thinking God was only for emergencies. She had been in the Walker house for 3 years now, since Leah was 4, and the world had grabbed the wheel and spun the family into a ditch. Ruby lifted her eyes from the drawing to the child whose heart rode inside it. "You made my headscarf perfect," she said. "And those freckles, are you teasing me?" "They're cute," Leah said. "Miss Ruby, can we tape it on the fridge so it can watch us eat pancakes?" "Indeed we can," Ruby said, "and we'll let it judge whether I burn them or not." They were still laughing when the click of heels entered the room like a second hand dropping on a clock, sharp, precise, uninterested in song. Victoria Langford stood in the doorway, as if the door were a stage and the hallway an audience. Blonde hair sleek as a magazine spread, tan dress that moved like cream, posture you could balance a book on. Every detail spoke of someone who took life like a test and expected an A for showing up. "What's going on here?" she asked, voice soft, eyes honed. "I drew us," Leah said, bright as a bell. "Me and Miss Ruby." "She's my family, too." Victoria took the paper between her French-tipped fingers and studied it the way a judge studies a case that's already decided. Then, without anger, without anything, really, she tore it in two. The sound was a small thing, paper rending, but it cracked across Leah's face like cold wind. Ruby reached out, hand rising by the wisdom of bone and blood, but she stopped short, an old rule anchoring her. Never reach for what a house has not offered. "This is inappropriate," Victoria said in the tone polite people use when they choose cruelty but call it clarity. "You're getting confused." Leah's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Tears leapt to her eyes. Proud tears that tried to stay in and failed. She bolted. The bathroom door clicked, and the house swallowed a child sobbing the way a sea swallows a stone. Ruby bent to gather the halves, as if a person had been broken, not paper. "Miss Victoria," she said gently, "the little one." "This is between me and my fiancé's daughter," Victoria said, "and there are kinds of look that silence more than words." She used one of those looks. Ruby lowered her eyes, every nerve in her body remembering the cost of speaking too soon in a home not your own. What Victoria did not know was that a man had stopped at the end of the hall. Richard Walker, 43, a man built of early mornings and closing deals, stood with a phone he had come back to fetch and watched the steadiness of his house tilt. He saw the paper, the blunt act of tearing, the way Ruby's hands trembled but her shoulders stayed squared, the way his daughter's small back folded around a sob. He had built a life on never acting from emotion, on letting feelings dry out, and turn to facts before he moved. But sometimes a fact walks into a room already wearing the clothes of conviction. He stood without moving, and something old in him, not his age, but a piece of himself that had gone quiet when his wife died, sat up and looked around. Before this morning, the house had been performing an uneasy dance. Richard's life with Victoria had the symmetry of a chessboard, clear pieces, clear moves. They matched on paper. She fit in a society photo the way pearls fit a throat. When he took her to fundraisers, people nodded, like an equation had balanced. He appreciated what she brought. Order, poise, a public fluency he didn't possess. He had not noticed the flinches that happened on the edges when Ruby was in the room. The way air behaves around a closed door. Richard had married young, loved fiercely, been loved back with a warmth that set the tone for his days. The accident came like an eraser. Grief taught him its brutal math. How to divide the hours, subtract the laughter, multiply the worries. He threw himself into work, fooled himself into thinking efficiency could parent a child or mend a hole. When Ruby came evaluated by the agency, vetted by references, calm in the interview, astonishing in the kitchen when she knelt to eye level with a silent 4-year-old and asked, "What should I know about your favorite toy?" Richard had to admit that Grace sometimes wears sensible shoes. Ruby came from Selma, from a home where her mother kept 3 children and a cake business afloat with prayer, flour, and a laugh wide enough to fit a bad day in. The oldest, Ruby grew her muscles on responsibility. By 12, she could calm a fussy baby and bake cornbread without a recipe. She learned to show up quietly, to read the air, to turn chores into ritual and ritual into love. When she moved to Atlanta, her goal was simple: steady work, a safe place to lay her head, enough left over each month to send a little home. Leia made the kind of trust that startles you with its speed. The child rehearsed grief each night, dreaming of the mother who'd left this world and waking to a house that never promised morning would feel simpler. And there was Ruby. Star-shaped pancakes, gospel hums threaded through hair braiding, library visits where books were not just borrowed but blessed, the art of wrapping a blanket around a nightmare and tucking it in where it couldn't get out. Ruby kept boundaries like a gardener keeps fences clear, necessary, with a gate that swung open to the right people. She didn't say love out loud often, not at first. She let it leak from habit instead. And yet, in houses like the Walkers, there are always rooms where old rules draft the air. The rule Ruby understood was this: you may be indispensable, but never central. You may be essential, but not family. Keep your love wide and your profile narrow. This is how you survive the day you might be told to pack in an hour. Victoria's rules were different. She had grown up with polished floors and the understanding that some people cleaned them. Her mother taught charity the way some mothers teach cooking good to do, better to be seen doing. As a girl, she learned to say thank you to the maid and not to look too long. When she met Richard, she wanted the role more than the man. Wanted a stage on which to prove that order could conquer grief. That control was the same as care if you dressed it in tenderness. So in the weeks before the drawing, the house learned to hold its breath. Victoria's comments were never ugly on paper. They arrived wrapped in compliments. So grateful for all you do, Ruby, though bedtime is really a parent's job. Or, Laya talks about you constantly, dear. I worry it's not healthy. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. She had a different kind of volume. When the bathroom sobs faded to hiccups and silence, Ruby found the courage to knock gently and slide her back down the opposite wall to sit on the floor beside the door. "I'm here," she said. "No matter who tells you I'm not." A small voice squeezed through wood. "She said you're not allowed to love me." "You know what we say when someone tells us something that isn't true?" Ruby asked. "We send it back like wrong mail. Return to sender, we say. Then we talk to the people who tell the truth." "Do you tell the truth?" Laya asked. "I do my best," Ruby said, "even when it costs me." The door latch turned. Laya fell into Ruby's lap and tucked herself there the way birds tuck into their nests when the wind is ridiculous. Ruby rocked. Rocking is older than any of us, and it works. At the end of the hall, the phone in Richard's hand felt heavier than glass should. Quietly, he turned and walked to his office. The monitors on his desk flickered to life, one of them showing the still frame of a hallway and a torn page like a fallen flag. He watched it once. Then he watched it again. Then he closed his eyes, rested his forehead against steepled fingers, and let a question he had been keeping in the basement climb a few steps toward the light. What exactly do I want my house to be? Morning entered the kitchen with the sound of a knife tapping apple slices into the shape of hearts. Ruby did it without thinking. Habit had become art years ago. Leia sat at the table, cheeks clean but eyes still swollen from crying, coloring quietly. Victoria floated in, all lotions and light perfume, the kind of woman whose shadow wore shoes. "Good morning, Princess," she said to Leia. "Good morning," Leia answered with a politeness that had lost a little of its thread. "Children need structure," Victoria said to the room, which was her way of saying it to Ruby. "Consistency, boundaries. Children need the truth," Richard said from the doorway. His tone had acquired a new temperature, overnight cool, not cold, like a lake that's clean enough to see your face in. "Victoria, outside a moment." They stood by the roses Ruby had pruned into a humility roses rarely learn. The air smelled of cut grass and something about to change. "I saw what you did," he said. "Richard," she replied, letting his name do half the work. "I was structuring." It's unhealthy to blur lines. She's too attached to that woman. She tore a picture, he said, looking not at Victoria, but at a place just above her shoulder, as if reading words there only he could see. That woman has stayed through every fever and fear. You didn't set a boundary. You made a cut. Are you really doing all this over a nanny? He blinked slowly. She's not a nanny. She's Ruby. She drew herself taller. Then perhaps you should marry her. The cruelty of it was tidy. It fit in a sentence and could be folded in a drawer if you needed to forget it later. He didn't answer. Not because the sentence hurt, but because it revealed more than she intended. He was learning to read. Inside, Ruby kept busy on purpose. Busy is a good rope to hold when the ground shakes. She folded towels as if doing so built a wall between Leia and harm. She hummed to ask God to mind the corners. She moved in patterns that made calm visible. That night, the house hosted people it didn't need, but had invited anyway, men with clipped laughter, women with rings that threw small comets around the chandelier. A private dinner, Victoria called it, a simple celebration of an engagement that no longer lived in Richard's chest. Ruby set the table with a precision that felt like dignity. The china that said, "You mean something," instead of, "Don't you dare chip me." The linen napkins with the gold W that for years had stood for Walker and for weeks had stood for wrong. When she turned to slip back into the kitchen, Richard stopped her with a gentle palm held up. "Stay for dessert," he said. "Leia would love it." Ruby blinked. You learn to hide surprise when you work in houses like this, but some kindnesses are large enough to show. "That's very sweet," Victoria said with a smile so thin it could cut paper. "But unusual." "What's unusual?" Richard asked, meeting her eyes. "Loving my child openly, or pretending we don't know who does the loving?" Silence pulled up a chair. People laughed because that's what people do when truth drops by uninvited. Dessert came. Apple pie and vanilla ice cream beaded with cold like a drinks glass in July. Compliments came too, earnest but aimed low, as if Ruby's talent were a trick politely applauded after the real show. "You could open a bakery," one of the lawyers said. "I like cooking for people I love," Ruby answered. "Yes," Victoria said softly, "but there's a difference between a home and a career." Was a sentence dressed like advice. It wanted to pass for wisdom. It was neither. "Some people shine wherever they stand," Richard said. The gentlest of rebukes laid like a hand on the shoulder of pride. He did not look at Victoria when he said it. He looked at his daughter, the one learning how adults treat what children value. After the guests left with compliments and uneaten opinions, Victoria climbed the stairs in a storm dressed as silk. Richard sat in the living room with a glass he didn't drink. He listened to the house relearn quiet. He let a decision expand inside him until it filled his bones. Morning brought the click of luggage and the whir of anger doing its hair. "You can't be serious," Victoria said when he told her. He handed her a black folder paperwork that had felt inevitable last week and irrelevant now, and a handwritten note he had stayed up late to compose in a hand that hadn't written anything personal in years. He did not follow her to the door. He didn't need to. Some exits don't require witnesses. They require resolve. When the tires on the driveway laced their sound through the house, and the house unheld the tension it had been holding. Richard exhaled a quarter of a lifetime. He walked to the guest room where the nightlight did its modest work. Leia slept, one arm thrown across her face like a small, confident gate. Ruby stood by the lamp, hands folded. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't owe me more than your truth," she replied. "Then here it is. I let someone reduce you to a role so I could reduce my responsibility. You were central to my daughter's life, and I called you peripheral to make it easier to live with my absence." Ruby's eyes shone without falling. "Tomorrow we'll make pancakes," she said. "Children know change by breakfast." Change did come at breakfast, but it was not pancakes. It was plastic beads and a navy dress. A week later, the city's Philanthropy and Family Values Gala called the rich and the comfortable to a ballroom that smelled like orchids and old money. Richard had promised a speech about corporate responsibility. He had written 12 drafts that said all the correct things about tax incentives and measurable outcomes and the moral arithmetic of giving. Then the drawing tore, and the drafts went cold. "I'd rather not go," Ruby said when he invited her. "I'm not made for rooms like that." "You don't have to speak," he said. "Just be." Presence can be a testimony. She wore navy because it gentled her spirit, because it reminded her of a church dress she had once owned when all she owned was one dress. Leia insisted on choosing the earrings, a wobbly pair she had strung herself on elastic thread, pink and blue alternating the way breathing alternates. They walked in together, father, daughter, caregiver, and people turned not with cruelty, but with curiosity, which can feel kinder and still sting. Richard did not pause. He moved to the podium and set his papers aside. He wasn't going to need them. "Good evening," he said, and the room obeyed. "My name is Richard Walker. I run a business, but that's not what I want to talk about." A shuffle of chairs, the polite sound of people adjusting their expectations. "I was going to speak about responsibility, the kind you can measure on a spreadsheet. But responsibility lives in a house before it ever asks for a grant. Something happened in my home that taught me the difference between control and care." He spoke of a hallway and a child's drawing. He spoke of a woman whose job description was smaller than her love. He spoke an apology in public, a simple, "I see you, I'm sorry, thank you," and the room learned there is a kind of wealth that doesn't arrive in accounts. He reached into his coat and pulled out a picture taped back together. Leia had done the work, small hands pressing Scotch tape over torn edges until a thing that had been broken remembered itself. He held it up. "My daughter fixed this. She taught me what to fix." The ovation began in the corner and traveled across the room like weather. Ruby sat small, as if staying small could keep the moment from getting bigger than she was. Leia squeezed her hand with ferocity, as if she were keeping Ruby from floating away. Afterward, offers rushed the family like a tide interviews, profiles, a book deal, a brand of candles called Home, but Ruby declined them all. "I don't need an audience to love the people God gave me," she said. She kept her job. Richard offered to call it something else, to write manager on a card. She smiled. "I won't say no to respect, but I'd like to keep my work the same." Respect changed anyway. Doors that had required knocks now opened because someone met her halfway. Staff who had been careful now were also kind. The house learned to say please and thank you, not because it had to, but because gratitude is the music of homes that last. There are always aftershocks when a stone is pulled from a wall. Victoria posted a version of events online where she was the victim of misunderstanding. People who liked the sound of her voice repeated it. But others told stories, too quiet ones, from other homes, of doors nearly closed in good women's faces until someone stopped the door with a foot and said, "Not today." The story did not become a war. It became a mirror, and everyone looked for themselves in it. In the months that followed, Leia bloomed. Children bloom anyway, but she did it in color now. She started a tradition. Every Friday she drew a new picture of her and Miss Ruby and her dad. Sometimes they stood under a tree. Sometimes they baked. Sometimes they held a sign that said, "Family is a verb." On warm evenings, Ruby and Leia played a game on the back lawn, cloud shapes and what they meant. "That one looks like a rabbit," Leia would say. "That one looks like a mended heart," Ruby would answer. "How can you tell?" Because it's prettier than you think a broken thing could be. Richard learned the choreography of presence. He left the office earlier. He learned to braid in a pinch, badly and with apologies, and found that laughing at himself taught his daughter more strength than winning another contract did. He made mistakes. He apologized. He learned that apologies spoken to a child are not weakness. They are carpenters, and carpenters fix things. One evening, after a day that had been ordinary, in the beautiful way ordinary days are, Leia carried a new drawing to the patio. "You need to see this," she said, and need had the gravity of a small person who has measured something big. In the picture, the three of them stood in a kitchen. Ruby had flour on her cheek. Richard wore an apron with a crooked W on it. Leia held a wooden spoon like a scepter. Above their heads a banner read, "Our Real Family." The letters were straight this time. Practice does that. Ruby swallowed the lump in her throat. "We should frame this one," she said. "We should frame the first one, too," Richard said, "tape and all. The fix matters as much as the hurt." They hung the first drawing in the hallway where the tearing had happened, not as a shrine to pain, but as a promise to pay attention. On good days it looked like an old wound that had learned to speak kindly. On bad days it looked like a warning. Either way, it told the truth. If you had walked by their house on any given Saturday thereafter, you might have seen a man on a ladder cleaning out gutters, while a little girl shouted up instructions invented on the spot, and a woman laughed so hard she had to sit down on the grass to get her breath. You might have thought it was nothing. That is how miracles prefer to be seen. One night, after Leia fell asleep with a book face down on her chest and a light still on for courage, Richard stood at the kitchen counter with a mug, steam threading itself loose. Ruby was rinsing dishes, sleeves pushed up, wedding band tan line a faint ghost from a life she honored by living well. They spoke without looking at each other, because some truths are easier when you let them sit beside you instead of staring them down. "You changed my house," he said. She shook her head. "Your daughter did. She couldn't have without you." Ruby set a plate in the rack and let the water run a little longer than it needed to. "You know what my mother used to say?" she asked. "She'd say, 'Baby, love ain't a possession, it's a job.' People think it's fireworks and angels. Mostly it's remembering what somebody likes on their sandwich and listening to their story when yours seems louder." He smiled, the kind of smile that hasn't been used in a while and creaks a little. "What do you like on yours?" "Tomatoes thin and salt heavy," she said. "That's how my mother made 'em, when the tomatoes came in too fast all at once." He nodded as if the answer was not only about sandwiches. He did not ask her on a date. He did not promise a future she had not been consulted about. He stood in the comfortable truth. They were a family today. Tomorrow would take care of itself. And that, for now, was enough. Months later, in the sweet indecision of spring, Richard and Ruby sat on the last step of the back porch while Leia practiced cartwheels that were half courage, half physics. "Watch me," she cried. And that is the prayer of every child and the work of every adult. "Watching," Ruby said. "Cheering," Richard added. Leia landed a wobbly one and leapt to her feet, arms high, joy making her taller. "Did you see?" "We saw," they said together, and her grin could have lit a street. The sky pressed dark at the edges and held a handful of stars, like salt you sprinkle over something good. Fireflies began their small applause. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed a clear 8. Ruby stood and brushed grass from her dress. Time for bedtime charts and teeth arguments, she said. Can I make the cocoa? Richard asked. You can, she said, if you remember the extra spoon of sugar. I remember, he said, and meant more than cocoa. They walked in. The door swung shut. The house inhaled them, the way a home does when it has learned the names of the people it loves. Every story worth telling has a moment where someone decides who they are. In this one, there were three. A child decided that love is not a secret, even when it hurts to say it out loud. A woman decided that dignity doesn't mean silence, that her work was sacred because it was love in work clothes. A man decided that the worth of his house was not the square footage but the size of its welcome. If you need a lesson for the road, and most of us do, it may be small enough to write on a fridge calendar. Family is a verb. It's what we do for each other on Tuesday afternoons and Sunday mornings, and during the bad news that arrives when no one is ready. It is not scared of job titles. It is not allergic to color. It seats everyone who loves the child at the same table and asks them to pass the bread. When you look around your own life, ask yourself who keeps it from falling apart in the quiet. Who tapes the drawings back together when someone rips them? Who hums at the sink and knows your sandwich order? Call them by their name. Tell them you see them. Make it public if it helps. Make it a habit, even if it doesn't. And if this story stirred something in you, if you've got your own Miss Ruby, your own hallway that needs a framed promise, share it in the comments. Tell us about the people who taught you that love is a job worth clocking in for. If you want more stories that try to honor the unseen and lift up what matters, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. We'll keep telling them as long as you keep listening, because everyday miracles don't make headlines by themselves. They need a witness. Today, you were one.